just wanna make you sweat. I wanna make you sweat. I just wanna make you sweat. I wanna make you sweat. Sweat,
sweat. Greetings, I'm Salvador Cordova. Glory and honor to our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Thank you to all of the supporters of this channel, many of whom I've actually met outside of this channel. A lot of my financial donors, especially, I've met in person, and some of them have probably never even watched my videos here, which is sometimes just as well, because sometimes I'm just rambling. This channel has been sometimes an outlet for me to just have an editing room floor for some of my more polished ideas and videos. By the way, I hope you enjoyed the music of Snoop Doggy Dogg, or Snoop Dogg. His lyrics are just filthy and awful, but his music, the melodies and the orchestration can be nice. And I got one of the more sanitized parts of his performance at the AFL Grand Classic or Championship Games in Melbourne, Australia. You heard him shouting, Melbourne, make some noise. I'm sorry. In today's segment, I'll be highlighting how I vanquished Nick Matzke. Nick Matzke is an evolutionary biologist of the fame of Kitzmiller versus Dover. He has a Wikipedia entry. He became famous because of his work on that trial. Kitzmiller versus Dover is infamous for being the intelligent design trial, where the intelligent design side was cast out of that particular district's public schools, and the judge ruled like it's not science or something. And for what it's worth, and I'll get myself in a lot of hot water with some of my colleagues, I don't defend the hypothesis. I don't defend the claim that intelligent design is science. I will say that there is scientific evidence that may point to that conclusion, but I wouldn't actually say that it's science. I think it's a historical claim. It's not repeatable experimental stuff. And so if you press me for it, I would say my default answer is no. So, I would say evolutionary theory on the also is not by and large science. Maybe parts of it are, but most of it is speculation and bad logic, circular reasoning, equivocations, and all sorts of rhetorical gimmicks to help people believe it's true. But by and large, it doesn't agree with the best understanding of the laws of physics and chemistry and statistics and whatever have you. So that was the Kitzmiller. That's evolutionary biology, and that's also I gave you my opinion about intelligent design. I am a young Earth creationist, although I have said there are still some challenges to the theory, even though I find it more and more believable every day. Now, how did I get involved in this? I nearly left the Christian faith 20 years ago, I had bouts of agnosticism, and I had lost faith in the Bible. And I said, well, at the time I had 3 science degrees. I have 5 now and working on a 6th and 7th. And all I could do was just use my science. I said, well, science is, it doesn't solve everything, but it's what I was trained in. And as I said, well, maybe the one place to look for evidence of God is in the origin of life. And as I studied it, I said, life must be a miracle. In fact, the importance of one flavor of intelligent design, which I call atheistic intelligent design, which is founded mostly by Fred Hoyle, a physicist who's an atheist, but he believes in intelligent design, except that the intelligent designer isn't God, but basically the whole universe. It's kind of a pantheistic viewpoint, but on some level, even the pantheistic, supposed pantheistic intelligent designer has a lot of skill sets, shall we say, that look like the Christian God. So that was very significant to me. If someone who is so anti-God would bow down and have to say that life is a miracle, then I said, I think this is way more than just a cultural phenomenon. I think Fred Hoyle was sincere uh, when he said his scientific expertise uh, suggested that life had an intelligent origin. He was also extremely critical of evolutionary theory. And there's a similar story for agnostic Michael Denton, who wrote the book Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. And ironically, even though he doesn't support intelligent design, his book, along with the book Mystery of Life's Origin by Thaxton, Bradley, and Olson, had spawned the modern version of the ID movement. Intelligent design has its roots all the way to classical times, at least the Roman times of Cicero, maybe earlier. So it has definitely both Christian, Jewish, and pagan roots. And now in the modern day, even atheistic roots, if you include people like Fred Hoyle. People wonder, well, why do you want Christian creationists to study this? And I'd say, well, there's something to be said about hearing testimony from hostile witnesses, people who are not Christians, who will also find some of the elements of intelligent design correct. Doesn't that lend force to the arguments? Because in that situation, you can't accuse intelligent design being purely motivated by cultural forces or religious viewpoints or metaphysical viewpoints. The data indicate it. And this is where Nick Matzke, evolutionary biologist, and I disagreed, obviously. And as I had debated him on the internet ever since about 2005, about 8 years later, we were going back and forth. And I said, he seems like mostly a decent guy, but when it comes to evolutionary biology, he's willing to break every moral fiber of his body to defend it. To him, it seemed like it's a culture war, and in love and war, everything is fair play, so to speak. And I noticed that sometimes I would just make basic stuff, and he would anything I would say, he would just try to reflexively take the opposite position. And I've done this with other evolutionary biologists. I said, you know what I'm going to do? I suspect they just reflexively want to disagree with anything I say. I could quote textbooks. I could quote what my professor at the National Institutes of Health, FAES graduate school, taught me that very day. And I'll just post it on a comment somewhere, maybe in passing, and they'll find a way to disagree with it. And I laughed. There's this one really bitter guy, evolutionary biologist, who had a hard time getting a job as an evolutionary biologist by the name of John Harshman. Man, what a nasty individual. He did back me up one time, but by and large, he's been pretty nasty to me. And so one time I said the readers, writers, and erasers in chromatin, in the chromatin system, or the chromatin processing system. And he said, that's not true. And I laughed. I said, dude, this is right here from the lectures that I took at the NIH. And then I showed him peer-reviewed papers to that effect. He didn't back down. And I'm like, yeah, these guys are all about saving face at all costs, defending the reputation of the tribe, even when the tribe is wrong. It's important for them to look good among their peers, lest they be shunned and outcast. And, they absolutely do not want to ever admit that they made a mistake. They wish to convey this air of infallibility and superiority. And it's really galling to them when a creationist comes along who actually knows more than them in certain fields. And I know it kind of bothers them when I rub it in. And that has only gotten more acute as I have been mentored by very fine scientists. I've been their co-authors, privileged to be their co-authors. And as um, Dr. Sanford had sent me to school and to conferences to learn more, I started to realize these guys should not be, these guys, meaning the evolutionary biologists, should not be my peer reviewers. I know more about protein biology than most of them, and more about biophysics than most of them. You know, that's partly because I'd studied applied physics at Johns Hopkins University, and then in my professional work, and then also going to the FEAS graduate school to study biology, combining the biology and physics, I got more of this. And then I published papers, one in Oxford University Press, in a specialized field in biochemistry known as structural bioinformatics. And I'm like, these evolutionary biologists posture themselves as knowing how everything works and figuring out how it evolved. First of all, they don't know how even a lot of proteins work. I've learned that as I've interacted with them. Some aspects of biochemistry I know better than them. And so, in this discussion today, I will show how Nick Matzke can't even bring himself to admit something that a 6-year-old could admit. So let me bring this little illustration up. So you see here, hopefully, a picture of coins. This, by the way, was sometime in the not too distant past. I was invited to speak at the Discovery Institute. I was privileged to be invited. And I gave a presentation to a lot of scientists. Some of them are professors in various fields like biochemistry, physics, medical science. Some of them are medical doctors, very senior. You can kind of guess the caliber of the people there. I'm not going to, I'm not going to try to pull the wool over their eyes. If I say something wrong, I mean, these are my seniors. We might call them peers, but they're actually way above me. I can't, some of the stuff that I defend should be defensible in a typical university classroom. And so I showed this diagram here at my talk. And so I just said, look, you have a fair coin like that, just the picture. And when you have them all heads and also nicely arranged, I said, that's very improbable. And it's improbable based on something called the binomial distribution. So typically, if I just randomly flip coins, you should see approximately half of them being heads, half of them being tails. Now, that's because there's certain, in physics, we have called inertia tensors. If the inertia tensor that describes the properties of an object, the inertia tensor can tell you if it's highly unstable. That means it's very hard to make repeatable events. Like if you flip the coin, even if you try to control for all the variables, it's still unstable enough that just a slight deviation, like say the air temperature or the temperature of the coin, which would cause it to bend just a little bit, it would start to propagate in the course of the how this see, I have something I want to get rid of. It would tend to propagate something. There's something obnoxious here. Hang on, let me do a pause. Sorry about that little technical glitch. Um, where was I? Oh yes, the inertia tensor. Little variations in the atmosphere. I mean, we don't know the position and momentum of every molecule in the atmosphere. That we might do a coin flip, same for all the molecules in a coin. That's based on Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. So at some point, you cannot control for every variable down to the umpteenth decimal place. There will be uncertainty, and that's all the way down to the bottom of quantum mechanical fabric of the universe. So that being said, this configuration of coins is highly improbable because the approximately common or most normal configuration would be approximately 50% heads, 50% tails. And the more coins you have, the more it will tend, what I'd call the equilibrium condition, to be all coins 50% heads, 50% tails, not 100% heads or 100% tails. That's the tail of the distribution. And this little fact played out nicely. And this little fact played out nicely when this little fact played out nicely when I was invited to try to teach creationism to one of my friend's children. I met these friends through my Bible study. They're parents of three lovely children. One of them was a 6-year-old. And so I visited the family, and the whole family was there. And I said, okay, who will I teach creationism to? And it's really hard to do when you're just dealing with a 6-year-old. And I looked at the parents. I said, well, I'll just do what little I can, given that your son's 6 years old. And, since you're here, maybe you can give me input, watch how I interact with them, and maybe give me some pointers. So what little I could do is I took a bottle of coins, pennies, 20 of them. And I said, hey, Eli, come here. And I dumped them on the table. And we spread them out a little bit. And he was laughing. He was just glad someone was willing to play with them for a little bit. And his brother and sister were watching, his older brother and sister. And I said, Eli, okay, what I want you to do is go to your room. And when I call you, you come back. All right. And so I said, go to your room. And he ran. And then while he was gone, I took all the coins and made sure they're all heads. Then, they were on the table. And I said, Eli, come back. And he came back. And he smiled. He said, you touched them. You touched them. Meaning he could tell I did something to the coins. Now, if I had left the coins kind of in that 50-50 mix, when I poured it out on the table, it was basically 50-50. If I just flipped one or two coins, he probably wouldn't have noticed, or it's less likely. But when I flipped them all to heads, anything that was tails, I flipped to heads, he could notice. And a 6-year-old could know that. I could have done that with, say, even 30, 40 coins. It would be the same thing. And the reason it is improbable is because of the binomial distribution. It is far from what you would expect to see by a random process of flipping. Random processes will generate a nearly 50-50 mix of heads and tails. Nearly 50-50. And the larger number of coins you have, the more reliable it will be that it will converge on this, what I call an equilibrium condition of 50% heads, 50% tails. Now, there are some philosophical issues here. Why does the process seem almost deterministic that it's going to converge to 50% heads, 50% tails, even though you cannot predict individually, if you flip each coin individually, what its outcome would exactly be. So this is, that's what I showed you is the binomial distribution. Coins follow the binomial distribution. You're like, Sal, why are you going into coins and tails, heads and tails and coins? Aren't we talking about biology? Well, it turns out coins obey the binomial distribution, so do amino acids in terms of their left-handed and right-handed configurations. And they obey the binomial distribution over time. Over time, left-handed, if you started out with 100% left-handed amino acids, thermal and quantum mechanical processes will slowly take that 100% configuration of left-handed amino acids, what they call L amino acids, and convert it to a 50-50 mix of left and right-handed amino acids, the right being designated as D amino acids, D for dextrorotatory amino acids, dextro meaning right hand in Latin. And the point is, the amino acids of life seem to violate probability. It has a pattern that suggests a miracle happened. And despite what phony Professor Thumbed Up Dave Farina insists that they've solved the problem, they haven't. And they haven't for a number of reasons, one of which is, even if supposedly at some point it became all left-handed by some miracle, it doesn't stay that way for very long. And definitely when it starts to assemble into would-be proteins, those proteins won't remain in that configuration of all left-handed very long. And this is not good for a protein because, as for those who've taken biochemistry and are familiar with Ramachandran plots, and secondary structures like beta sheets and alpha helices, when you start to have right-handed amino acids, those nice alpha helices, you can actually see this in your biochemistry books regarding the Ramachandran plots and the way that the alpha helices twists. They'll twist one way if they're all left-handed. They'll twist another way, clockwise versus counterclockwise, if they're all right-handed. And you probably would get a mess if you got a mix. So it's very important for the stability of a cellular organism to have its proteins be left-handed when it's supposed to be left-handed. And as a matter of fact, living creatures try to recycle the proteins, certain proteins periodically, because they tend to degrade because of this phenomenon where left-handed amino acids will spontaneously start to flip into the right hand. And so there has to be regular maintenance done in order to maintain life. And once something is non-living, that maintenance process ceases. So that forgive the tutorial on all of this, but it's important that you know what all that I'm coming with to the table when I confronted Nick Matzke with a question that I basically ran by that little 6-year-old. So now remember, mind you, Nick Matzke is a PhD evolutionary biologist. He was famous for his role in the Kitzmiller versus Dover intelligent design trial. And he fed the lawyers a lot of stuff that I don't agree with, but they were used it in the trial nonetheless. And by the way, just as an aside, the star witness there for the Darwin side, Ken Miller, he said some really stupid stuff, which has since come out, and he's still posturing like he's still defending science. And, that's a whole nother story to touch upon. So I was getting really frustrated with Nick, and I'm saying, this guy's just reflexively disagreeing with everything I say. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to show him that this isn't about telling the truth. This is trying to just kind of disparage intelligent design proponents and creationists on anything they say. Even if it's true, you got to disagree, because heaven forbid a creationist is found actually telling the truth, or a creationist shows that he actually knows some science and math. And I said, I'm going to play a trick on it. I'm going to ask him just this really basic question. I bet he's going to take the opposite position, and he's going to embarrass himself. He will not answer the question. He'll do everything he can except make a simple yes or no. And my predictions came true. He was vanquished. So what I did, I told the owner of this blog, Uncommon Descent, and I'll show you a screenshot. I told Barry Arrington, I said, hey, Barry, I want you to do this. Tell Nick Matzke, I said something to the effect, let me see if I get this. I said something to the effect, ask Nick Matzke this question. If you came across a table on which was set 500 fair coins, and all 500 coins displayed the heads side of the coin, would you reject a random process as a hypothesis to explain this particular configuration of coins on a table? Now, for those who are not familiar with this, the word random process carries a lot of weight definitionally in the fields of science, particularly electrical engineering and statistics. The word random process says nothing about intention or intentionality. Random process talks about the probability of certain events, and you have lots of things called like distributions, like say the binomial distribution, the Poisson distribution, the normal distribution, etc., whereby there's like kind of like the average behavior. I call it an aggregate behavior of events. So like say if you're flipping coins, there's a 50% chance it's going to be heads, 50% chance it's going to be tails. And the aggregate average over like say a bazillion flips will be about 50% heads, 50% tails. And that is predicted by what they call the law of large numbers. So the word random process does not, and I insist not, say anything about intentionality or intelligence or whatever. It is just the behavior of a system described, a behavior of a system that is not very predictable except for like large numbers of outcomes, like an average. So what that means for like, for example, for the binomial distribution, if you flip a coin and it's heads, it tells you nothing about what your next flip is going to be, whether it's going to be heads or tails. It's independent Bernoulli trial or something like that. And but the random process of a binomial distribution will predict that a large number of coin flips will result in the average number of heads being seen to be about 50% and tails being about 50%. And that's basically it. It doesn't say at all anything about intelligence. It is entirely possible that a smart guy could be methodically saying, I'm going to turn this heads, I'm going to turn this tails, so it looks like a random distribution. It at least obeys all the laws. So I'm just saying, I'm not trying to even, I wasn't even, Matzke, I wasn't even asking you about anything about intelligent design, but he felt very uncomfortable. I knew he would feel uncomfortable about this. He probably thought he had me. One of the reasons that I knew he was falling into a trap, he was probably expecting that Sal's not too sharp. And I'd rather have my opponents think I'm not too sharp, when they debate me. I'd rather have them underestimate who they're dealing with. And he probably thought I was just going to repeat typical intelligent design talking points like the explanatory filter and William Dembski's specified complexity or irreducible complexity. And I'd start talking about intelligent design. I decided I wasn't going to do any of that. And by the way, when I teach intelligent design, I teach it a little bit unorthodox, in an unorthodox way. I assiduously avoid trying to rely on buzzwords like specified complexity or irreducible complexity. There are a number of reasons for that. One is, as I try to publish in peer review, you use words like that, instantly you will be rejected. And so you have to find other ways of making the same argument without using those buzzwords. The other thing is specified complexity is like taking this is something that came up in the ID community. It's like for me, it's like trying to swat a fly on your head with a sledgehammer. You're going to hurt yourself in the process and it may not be very effective. There are better ways to go about it using simpler methods. And one of the things you really just want to do is like, you want to first establish that something's not the product of a random process. There are two major classes of processes that we deal with in science. We have random processes and deterministic processes. A deterministic process is something like the orbit and the behavior of planets in the solar system. You can, with just a few data points, starting data points, like if you know the position of the Earth and the sun and the moon and their velocities and their distance from us, just those few points, maybe a few more, you can reconstruct using the laws of celestial mechanics when and where eclipses will occur in the next 1,000 years, or previously, what happened in the last 1,000 years, down to the day, maybe down to the hour, down to the exact GPS coordinates. And that's amazing. So a characteristic of a deterministic process is predictability. A stochastic process, as I described, it lacks certain predictability. There's a lot of uncertainty except for, like, say, aggregate statistics, like averages, or like what they sometimes call standard deviations, mean variance. Okay. Also, all sorts of aggregate metrics. And so if, as I said, in science, you have deterministic processes, you have stochastic. If none of those are good explanations, at what point do you start to entertain that intelligence had caused something? So again, just to emphasize the point, and think again of the 6-year-old kid, Eli. If he saw this, wouldn't he think that a human being had arranged the coins so nicely? Granted, the coins are designed, but the fact that they're all in this configuration with the head showing that it's not the product of random chance, but rather an intelligent designer. And so by way of, obviously you can conclude that because you've seen, he's human, he's able to do this. Therefore, he knows that there are intelligent designers capable of doing this. Now, we don't have access to God in the sense that we see him working these same sort of miracles in our present day. But if you extrapolate this to biological systems that obey the binomial distribution, I would hope someone would start to think that there is a miracle at play. I don't fault someone for being deeply skeptical because he's not seen God. On the other hand, I will fault someone who will insist that that this is a product of chance or just plain chemistry, because plain chemistry for certain biomolecules obeys the binomial distribution. Not all chemicals do when they start to react, but these certainly do. And so if you say it's just chemistry, I'll say, okay, this is the statistical equilibrium prediction. So you can't appeal to it. You can't just say it's just chemistry that made life, because chemistry should not have this configuration. Just plain unguided chemistry subject to a random process. To the extent that chemistry, there are parts of chemistry that are deterministic, like say ionic covalent bonds, but the actual configurations of certain organic molecules it's just subject to kind of like the random geometry of wherever some of the atoms happen to be when a reaction happened. And then we also know this experimentally. So you can't just say it's chemistry, something other than just plain normal equilibrium kind of chemistry made life. And so I don't know what to, what do you do with that? Well, if you don't want to believe intelligent design, at least say, I don't know. You don't go around saying, oh, we're going to solve it. I'm like, no, you're not. Why don't you, don't count your chickens before they hatch, first of all right? Uh, isn't the right answer, we don't know. You can say you're optimistic, but you certainly haven't solved it. And you can't be giving the impression to the general public that it's actually solved when it hasn't been, nor should you in good conscience say that we're going to solve it anytime soon. I've heard that story so many times, it's funny. When I was growing up, they were saying we're almost there, and then it went from that to being like, well, this is such a difficult problem, we have to appeal to space aliens. Some space, they're postulating aliens had made life because it's too hard for it to happen on Earth by itself, which is also a problematic explanation. But hey, at least they were acknowledging how difficult it is for life to emerge on Earth. And then it got so bad. Now we're talking, the famous evolutionary biologist Eugene Koonin has postulated we have to appeal to multiple universes, of which we happen to be just the one where all these improbable events happened. He fails to really address the fact that you can't test this, you can't prove it, you can't see it, you can't repeat it, and you can't absolutely know that it's true. So this is mostly a faith statement on Koonin's part. So let's get back to Nick Matzke. So what I had suggested to Arrington, I'm sorry to have been a little bit off topic, and did I lose? I think I may have. Hopefully, I didn't lose the. Hang on, let me just pause. So you heard my version of how I wanted it said. I wanted Arrington to ask Matzke, if you came across a table on which was set 500 fair coins and all 500 coins displayed the head side of the coin, would you reject a random process as a hypothesis to explain this particular configuration of coins on the table? Unfortunately, Arrington thought he could be a little looser in his words. I don't think it caused long-term damage. It still kind of made me unhappy. But this is the version Arrington had posed the question to Matzke. And you can find this on the Uncommon Descent website. Here is the URL. And Arrington asks, a statistics question for Nick Matzke. If you came across a table on which was set 500 coins, no tossing involved, and all 500 coins displayed the head side of the coin, would you reject chance as a hypothesis to explain this particular configuration of coins on the table? Now, granted, this is a little bit lawyerly, and Arrington is a lawyer. And the definitions are like, well, they're wordy and they're so restrictive. It's partly so that there's less ambiguity. I felt my version of the question was much more hard to wiggle around. But take it or leave it, this is what was said. And what he's saying is, do you think this is just a product of chance? Okay, it's a long way of saying, hey, Nick, if you came across a table where all these coins are heads and they're fair coins, I wanted to insist they have to be fair coins. If they're all heads, would you say that was a product of chance? And my bet was Nick Matzke is going to punt. He's going to feel really uncomfortable with that. And he did punt. And I'm going to show you some of the responses he made. But what I would like to point out is I had shared this with, I'd shared this anecdote with other people, and I said, look, that dumb evolutionary biologist couldn't even do it. A 6-year-old was so obvious to a 6-year-old. A 6-year-old could tell that wasn't the product of random chance. And someone astutely observed, he said, oh, no, Nick was smart enough. He knew the truth, but he had a lot to lose by admitting the truth. He had a lot to lose by admitting the truth. Because what that meant, and I'll go into this maybe in another video, is that we have a method of maybe sensing something is intelligently designed, even if we've never seen an object before. There's certain properties we can at least say that it's not the product of random chance or a deterministic process. It at least parallels, at least superficially looks designed. I'm not even saying it is designed, but you could certainly draw the parallels there. He was uncomfortable that we could even draw some parallels there, because for a lot of times, and I see this on the internet, they'll just say, actually one of my professors, unfortunately, James Treffel, loved James Treffel. He taught my course in supplemental relativity and quantum mechanics when I was still an undergrad at George Mason before I went to Johns Hopkins. He said, well, all those statistics, they're after the fact, you could say, what are the odds that I would meet my wife or whatever? And you could say that they're astronomically remote, but that doesn't prove that, that God was involved or there was an intelligent designer. He had a point, at least in the proper way. He had the correct viewpoint that there's certain ways you can frame a statistical argument that may seem superficially correct, and it would generate astronomically remote odds, but it is statistically flawed. For example, if I flipped a coin, if I had 500 coins, all right, and I, took a magic marker. Do I have one here, by the way? Well, here. If I took a Sharpie, and do I have a coin? I don't have one handy. And I marked the coin with a number, or I did something. I put a label on it. Say, this is coin 1, coin 2, coin 3, coin 4. And I took, say, 500 coins and flipped them randomly. And then I said, okay, I'll record now all of the, the configuration of each coin. Number 1 is heads, number 2 is tails, number 3 is also tails, number 4, et cetera, all the way to 500. And I could prove to you that it'd be astronomically remote that I can't flip all those coins randomly and arrive at the same sequence. Does that mean that sequence was the product of my intelligent direction, that first sequence? And of course, I would say no, because I'm the one who flipped it. So that is one case of what they call a Texas sharpshooter fallacy, where you take one configuration and say, oh, hey, it's really improbable, therefore it wasn't caused by a random process. That's illegitimate. The way to negate that is if, and a big if you appeal to something like the binomial distribution. Because in the example I just gave of the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, where I just take all these numbered coins and flip them randomly, they would still obey. They would most likely, based on the law of large numbers, still converge approximately on 50% heads, 50% tails. What will not happen, based on what we know about the behavior of random processes, is it's very unlikely an order of X number of sigmas, standard deviations, that it'll be all heads. The common, you'll have so many sequences that'll be approximately 50% heads, 50% tails. We can go on that in another discussion. This is part of my ID course. So there are ways, there are configurations that you cannot, your probability arguments cannot be accused of invoking Texas sharpshooter fallacies. Texas sharpshooter fallacies. It is a violation of expected probability, expected value, whatever you want to call it, whatever the proper term is. And so Nick Matzke, when we asked him, do you think random, would you reject chance as an explanation for why all this is heads? Would you reject chance? The proper answer is yes. I would reject it. I would reject chance as an explanation. Chance, it cannot be an explanation. You couldn't give a simple yes. That 6-year-old kid could. And now he felt really uncomfortable because now I know why. I suspect why. Because now he couldn't, as my professor, my beloved professor, Dr. Gene Streffel, he couldn't accuse the ID proponents of making up statistics and subtly, subtly infecting it with Texas sharpshooter fallacies. He could see now, I could make a statistical argument based on physics. Physics would predict that these coins would not be all heads, even just as much as I could similarly predict that amino acids in a prebiotic environment will not be all left-handed. He felt uncomfortable that we could actually make a solid statistical argument because for the longest time, people like Matzke and even I think Jason Rosenhaus says, no, there's no way you can come up with, patterns that would, reject chance as a hypothesis. And I'm like, yes, you can. There are not many of them, but you can. And by the way, I've seen those patterns in life. And if we were willing to work the math a little harder, we could probably do this for things like proteins and all the fabulous things they do. It's not going to be an easy task mathematically. But, I'll give you an example of something that's obviously not the result of chance, but of intelligent design, but actually demonstrating that chance will not form this house of cards is actually really hard. I invite a student of physics to try to figure out how to make a defensible argument why this is an improbable structure, that it cannot be the product of a random process. I've tried it and it's like, well, I came up with half plausible arguments that I do think could be developed if someone were really willing to, but it's not that easy. And by way of extension, it will not be easy to also argue that proteins are improbable. To be able to make those arguments, you'll have to pick some good proteins, topoisomerase being one of my favorites, and particularly ones that are what they call multimeric, where they have to have very precise connections, like locks and keys, by way of analogy. And then they're also part of a cascade of other proteins and systems. Then you can start to build a good probability argument that will resist accusations of a Texas sharpshooter fallacy. So Nick was really uncomfortable with this. And so I poured all that out just to show how hard it is to make things rigorous. And I will tell you what, evolutionists, evolutionary biologists, origin of life researchers would prefer you use the loosest terms possible so they have wiggle room. But once you start to make it rigorous in terms of what you would teach in basic college science and math courses, then they have no wiggle room. Because for them to refute your argument, they would have to refute what they're teaching in class. And I shamed Nick Matzke because of his refusal to answer that question. I said, "Is this the conduct that you would conduct yourself with in front of your students?" Him being maybe a professor or a prospective professor, I said, "Would you say stuff like this? Would you start dodging a simple question? It's either yes or no. And if you don't like the way the question is phrased," I said, "okay, you should be able to tell what we're trying to get at. Why don't you phrase the question in a way you think would be more fair for you to give a yes or no answer, like such as the one that I framed it. I said in terms of a random process, a stochastic process, such as a binomial distribution, whatever." He refused, and I said, you and then some of his supporters there. I said, "You guys ought to be ashamed of yourself. Would you conduct yourself in front of your students like this?" Of course they wouldn't. They'd look like fools, but they had to save face on the internet. They didn't want creationists like me to vanquish them. And so I hung Matzke out to dry. So let's see what he had to say. So unfortunately, to see the interaction, you have the comments section here, but the comments are written in reverse order. So you have like comment number 148, and they're numbered. Sometimes they're numbered. You could see the timestamp. What you have to do to actually see the exchange. And by the way, Nick Matzke got hammered, so I'm sorry. Let me show this. Okay, let's go back. So you could see, go to the Uncommon Descent website, look for this, and you have the URL up here. Look for this, and you can look at the comment section, but they're in the wrong backward order. The first thing you see is actually the last comment, and the first comment is actually the one last in the archives. It's bad. So scroll all the way down and then click on the last group of comments. And then you can kind of read them. If you read them in reverse order, you'll get them in the right chronological order. And if you're ever in doubt, just use the timestamp like down here. So again, remember the question is, if you came across a table on which was set 500 coins, no tossing involved, and all 500 coins displayed the head side of the coin, would you reject chance as a hypothesis to explain this particular configuration of coins on the table? Basically, would you reject chance as the explanation for it being all heads? And so there was one pro ID guy who weighed in. And then let's see, one anti-ID guy, if you back out, named Mark Frank. He said, oh, there's some more. So Mark Frank, who's a PhD student at the time in statistics, he said, chance is meaninglessly vague as a hypothesis as is designed. I would reject the hypothesis that someone had independently tossed each coin and each coin was fair. There are many other plausible mechanisms are far more likely to produce that configuration. Some of these involve intelligence. Someone placed them that way. Some of them do not. They might have slid out of a pocket of coins without a chance to turn over. And Nick Matzke said, oh, what Mark said. He agreed. Okay. And then Nick Matzke says, another hypothesis is that all the coins have heads on both sides. And this is, let's see. This is where I got on Arrington. I was like, Arrington, you should have used the word fair coins. There's a reason I said use the word fair coins. And the thing is, okay, I eventually responded and someone weighed in. What's with this thread, all this thread on Matzke? You will be asking for his autograph next? Okay. Okay, so I responded. So Mark Frank, in defense of Matzke, said they might have slid out of a packet of coins without a chance to turn over. That is the idea that you have a packet of coins where all the coins are heads. Well, how are they going to get all heads in the first place to be in that packet, right? That means the chance could not have made them all heads in that packet. So chance can't be an explanation. You see, this is just like you're starting to do the Chewbacca. You're starting to involve all these other extraneous ideas that it'll take time to refute it. But in the case that all the coins in the packet are all heads, that means the chance didn't make it all heads. Just the fact that you poured it out on the table, it doesn't negate the fact that they're all heads because of something that is not a random process. A random process will not pack the coins all heads. But you see, you have to, these guys are very slippery. They'll put all sorts of derailments, all sorts of things that'll just kind of change the subject subtly, kind of add confusion. And sometimes I will try to engage and say, look, despite what you say, it doesn't negate that a chance process can't make this. And Nick Matzke said, another hypothesis is all the coins have heads on both sides. And again, I told you Arrington should have used my phrasing because I would have insisted to use the word fair coins. But that is still easily remedied. Because if you came across the table and you saw all the coins laid out heads, you could inspect to see whether they're heads. The other side is a tail. You could do that for all 500 coins. So you can falsify that hypothesis. Again, Nick Matzke cannot bring himself to say, I reject chance as a hypothesis. He felt uncomfortable. And I was like, look, a 6-year-old kid could totally see. Something is making you really uncomfortable. And it's probably not worth it to go through all the comments. Definitely not. I'll just get a few more. So Nick Matzke is trying to hide behind Mark Frank. And I called Matzke out on this. I said, Mark didn't answer with a simple yes or no. Is this the sort of answer you'd give your students if they posed the question to you? The question was, would you reject chance as the hypothesis for explaining the configuration? 1, two-headed coins is a rejection of the chance hypothesis. So you'd still answer yes. Sliding out of a coin wrapper in the original configuration is a rejection of the chance hypothesis for the reasons I just stated. Having a robot mechanically order them is a rejection of the chance hypothesis. Having some space intelligence, space alien configure them is a rejection of the chance hypothesis. You'd almost never hear such silly evasions in the discussion of simple statistics. You can't find it in yourself, Dr. Matzke. Yes, I would reject chance as in some sort of random process as an explanation. You'll stress irrelevancies, start talking about anything rather than say yes. I hammered him on this. This was unworthy behavior of a scientist. And why am I pointing this out? What if Matzke were my peer reviewer? And I was just trying to say, look, I would reject a random process as generating these coins. He'd say, oh, that's out of the scope of the journal. And then he'd give all these excuses. And it's like, oh, Salvador Cordova's name, automatic reject. Do you see? This is the sort of thing. They say, why don't you publish in peer review? This is exhibit 1 in my case for intelligent design. That your peer reviewers would be people like Nick Matzke of Kitzmiller versus Dover fame, he has a lot in the game to save face for himself, save face for uh, his tribe, save face for having spent all these years in school learning evolutionary biology and defending it, and then defending origin of life hypotheses, only to be proven wrong. He has a lot to lose. And it's like that astute observer once pointed out, and I said, Matzke was too stupid to say this, and I was corrected. The astute observer said, no, Matzke knew it. The little boy, little 6-year-old Eli, had nothing to lose by telling the truth. Matzke had a lot to lose by dealing with the truth, by telling the truth. And I called him out on this. I said, this is unworthy behavior of a university professor. If you didn't like the way Arrington framed it, or even the way I framed it, it's like, look, I think you can kind of guess where we're headed. Why don't you try to rewrite what we are trying to say in a form where you could either give a simple yes or no. Of course, they're not going to cooperate. Of course, they're not going to try to give you pointers on how to frame something a little more rigorously. So this is the runaround I get. And I've gotten the same runaround from other evolutionists on the net. Not quite as severe, but also from Dr. Dan, and especially his supporters. I get the same. And he said, why don't you submit to peer review? And they keep saying, you're obviously not scientists because you're not publishing this in peer review. I'm giving you evidence of how they conduct themselves. If they conduct themselves like Matzke does of Kitzmiller versus Dover fame, Dr. Matzke, professor of evolutionary biology, if he conducts himself on so simple a question about coins being all heads on a table, if he conducts himself this way, how much more will he behave so illegitimately in reviewing papers that might challenge the viewpoint he's trying to defend? I'm just pointing that out. And so Dr. Dana says, why don't you submit? I'm like, no way. For one, I have evidence. You guys do not back down. Saving face is more important. And I have evidence of that for Dr. Dan himself. I've caught him saying stupid stuff and he refuses to back down. And I'm like, dude, would you say this stuff in front of biochemistry students? Would you say this stuff in front of population genetics students or mathematicians who actually understand the Poisson distribution? And I could go on and on and on. And so far, he hasn't backed down on some of the statements he said when he's trying to contest me on the internet. And I'm just like, okay, I see the game. It's about saving face. You have to appear infallible. I get that. You have to say what helps the tribe out, at least for the interim, even though you have to say stupid stuff in their defense. Save face at all costs and never admit the creationist got something right, which you got wrong. Make the creationist look as incompetent as possible, even if it means you have to say something that's not exactly true. Yeah, I get it. And, Dr. Dan will sometimes stress irrelevancies, make the most uncharitable interpretations of what someone says. And, when he's served up kind of his own medicine, he doesn't like it so much. He's a great guy, but, I have to start calling him out on it. This is starting to feel like war, especially after I had made a lot of effort to make a presentation and he just poured urine all over it. He and his companion, Zach Hancock, is thoroughly disgusting. And I'm like, that's the end of it. I'm going to start fighting back and I'm not going to be very nice about it. And so the other thing is, so you see where the peer reviewers are. The other thing is most evolutionary biologists do not have even the smallest expertise in some of these questions. I'm like a peon in protein biology and biophysics compared to my seniors in the field of chemistry and physics in the field of chemistry, that would be James Tour and Marcos Eberlin. The field of physics, it would be people like Dr. David Snoke, distinguished professor of physics, and he's like the director of the Quantum Information Processing Center or something like University of Pittsburgh, distinguished professor. He's on the ID side, I think, pretty sure, because he co-authored a paper with Michael Behe that was featured in Kitzmiller versus Dover. A geneticist like John Sanford, a population geneticist and nationally award-winning mathematician in Ola Hosjer. How about a editor of a secular peer-reviewed journal like Stuart Burgess, or emeritus professor of heavy thermodynamics and Andy McIntosh. I mean, I could just go on and on. Or how about even what is a quote-unquote lesser figure, but someone who's really still very senior, and Joe DeWeese, my co-author in an Oxford University Press publication in structural bioinformatics. I mean, okay, I listed all this out. And it's like, okay, I'll give you a list of who I would consider my senior peers. Evolutionary biologists are lower in these fields than I am. And I'm going to have to subject myself to people like Matzke, who know less than me about these topics. So how is this going to be remedied? Well, there is a proliferation of journals out there, and there are other venues that are not run by evolutionary biologists. And so sometimes we'll just have to sneak it into venues that are not explicitly evolutionary biology and kind of sneak in a little bit of a jab at them. And there are venues where this can be done, and it's going to be slow. We can also advocate, I think, having less taxpayer dollars that perpetuate this nonsense. It's our money after all, right? So if people want to perpetuate evolutionary biology, let them pay for it out of their own pocket. But don't rob creationists of that money to make them pay for something that they don't believe in and that I don't think is scientifically correct, which is evolutionary biology, by and large. Some parts of it are right, but by that same token, you can also say some parts of creationism are scientifically correct. So that's what I think. So let me know what you think in the comment section. Please like and subscribe if you like what you're hearing. I'd invite you to consider sending a small gift in the video description below. At the very least, if you're a Christian, please pray that the message moves forward and that people who need to hear it will hear it. I want to thank everyone who's tuned in today. Take care. Glory and honor to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and an early happy Thanksgiving to you all. Thank you.